9 o'clock. 9 o'clock and all is well. So, I don't know if they got started back there, but I'm going to get started. I always have a lot of material to cover. Last week, I think it was 18 pages for my notes. Today goes only 15, so we've got a little bit lighter. But no, we've had fun. We'll look at it and see what we can cover. Now, can you hear me better? Yeah, it helps if I turn it on, doesn't it? All right, very good. Well, before we start our class, Wes, will you lead us in a prayer as we begin, please?
Father in heaven, we are very grateful that we have the opportunity to be here this morning as your people to study your word. Father, I pray that we will listen with zeal this morning as we dive into your word, and that we listen attentively as Doyle speaks to us, that we study collectively as a group, that we learn as much as we can. Father, we love you so much. Thank you for this day that you've blessed us with. Again, Father, I pray that our study will leave us edified and encouraged this morning. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.
Amen. We're going to be studying in Genesis chapter 24. If you'd like to turn there and get a head start. I do make a little quick handout for our class so you can kind of follow along. If you didn't pick one up, there's some there in the back if you'd like to sneak back there and get one. We were looking at Abraham's servant. Character studies and specific concentration I'm making on servants on characters is their service and them being a servant. And maybe you're not as familiar with Abraham's servant as some are. What I think I want to do, if I can get this thing to work right, we're going to look very quickly at the 6 points we want to look at and find from this morning's lesson. One is a servant is given responsibility over his master's belongings. We'll find that. Number 2, a servant must be good for his word. He's going to have to do what he says he's going to do. We're going to find 3, a servant listens to and must follow his master's instructions. Number 4, a servant, and this is going to be a servant of God, a servant is going to look to God, he's going to pray to God, he's going to ask God for his help. And number 5, a servant is going to carry out his master's instruction. He finds out what he needs to do, he's going to be good for his word. He's actually going to do what he's supposed to do as a servant of God. And the last point we'll be considering, and we're going to go back over all these, is a servant looks to God for God's help, as God helps him providentially in whatever way that God may desire to do that. We're going to find all those points in Genesis chapter 24 as we look at Abraham's servant. What is Abraham's servant's name? Well, we do not know for sure, but if we go back to chapter 15, verse number 2, is God telling Abraham, I'm going to bless you through your seed, your descendants, all nations will be. And he didn't have a baby. There was no child through Sarah. And he said, well, maybe my heir would be, remember who that was at that time? Eliezer of Damascus was one of his servants. So he says, maybe it's him. Now, if he's still alive, because this would have been his number one servant, we're going to find this servant that's put into action here in chapter 24 is his chief number one servant. Is it Eliezer of Damascus? We don't know. He may have passed on by this time, but perhaps it is. But as we start looking at who this servant is, Abraham's servant. A couple of weeks ago, if you'll recall, if you were here, Woody talked about Abraham. His emphasis was, he's looking at Abraham, was Abraham's great faith. He had faith in God. He trusted in God. You remember, I'm going to give kind of an overview of it before we run up to this point of chapter 24. God called Abraham to leave the land of his fathers, Haran, and go to a land that God had promised him. He leaves on faith, and God promised him in chapter 12, all nations of the earth will be blessed through your seed. And so he and his wife Sarai and the part of the family, his close part of the family, even his nephew Lot, they traveled and they come to the promised land. And throughout this time, God continues to promise that you're going to have a son. You remember there's Hagar that ended up have Ishmael, which is not the promised one. It's through Sarah you'll have the promised one. And then finally they do have a son, and his name is, you can say it. No, Ishmael was Hagar's son. Isaac was being Abraham and Sarah's son. The point in time we come to our study is Sarah, of course they lived long age, Sarah has died. Isaac is grieving for his mother. Isaac is a single man. He's of an age to be married. Abraham sees it's time to go find a wife for his son. And I know some young people say, well, it'd be a whole lot easier if my parents would just go ahead and find one for me. Well, some places they do, don't they, Herschel? You know, they'll match up their children, marry off their children, decide that. And that's the way this was, that Abraham was going to find a wife for his son Isaac. Just a little tidbit, as you go on, you remember who Abraham then will marry after Isaac marries Rebekah? Remember who he marries? It was Keturah. I met a young lady a few years ago. Her name was Keturah. And I said, you have a Bible name. She said, yes, I know. It's like, doesn't everybody know? But then through Keturah, he then had, you remember how many sons he had after Sarah had died? He had 6 more sons. And he was even able to send them off with their own inheritance before he died. And then Isaac was given the bulk of the inheritance, then being his firstborn. But we come to the point here in Genesis chapter 24. Abraham was old. The Lord had blessed him extremely. And he calls the oldest servant of his house to him. This is verse number 2. It says, who ruled over all that he had. So this was the top guy of all of Abraham's possessions. And he tells him, put your hand under my thigh. Significance? It's the way you would make an oath. You would be saying you're going to do what you would do. Now this happens, it's going to, here again, he's going to be sure your hand's under my thigh. You know, we're going to make this oath. But it also happens, if you recall, is Jacob, you know, the patriarch Jacob, who's named Israel, he had Joseph, his son, put his hand under his thigh in making that promise that he would not leave him there in Egypt, but take him back to the land of his fathers to bury him. So it was a common pledge that they would do, as they would do that. So put your hand under my thigh. And he says, I'm going to make you swear. You're going to have to promise without any question that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites. Of course, he's thinking, I'm getting old. We need to find a woman for this guy, this young man. I may not be able to make it. You're going to be the one in charge of things. You're going to be sure and do this. But he's going to go even beyond that as well, his assignment was to do. You're to go back to my country. And that country was where? Haran, right? Babylon, back where he'd come from. You're to go back and you're to find a wife for my son Isaac. Now, by the way, if you have comment or something, we do have a walking mic, especially as we begin looking at application. I want you to help us with that. And the servant's going to say, what if she will not be willing to come with me back to this land? Must I take your son back to Haran? And Abraham said, do not take him back. It says, beware, you do not take my son back there. It says, the God of heaven, he promised, this is the land I'm come to, this is where I'm to be, and you're not to take him back. And he tells him then, in verse number 7, as he's making that promise, God's promised to him, to your descendants I will give this land. He said, so he will send his angel before you. And now this is the confidence he's giving this servant. He will send his angel before you. You shall take a wife for my son there. And if the woman is not willing to come, you'll be released from this oath. Only do not take him back to that land. So verse number 9, we find that servant putting his hand under Abraham's thigh. And he's making this promise that he would not take him back. Verse number 10, he goes about on his mission. He takes 10 of his master's camels, this would be Abraham's camels, and departed with his master's goods to go back to Haran. Now, how much can 10 camels carry? A whole bunch. Now, this would be like the trucks, the 18-wheelers we'll see traveling around. That's how they carried their goods from one place to the other. If you saw a 5 camel train, you say, well, that's a pretty good size one. If you have 8, ooh, that's a 10, that's a good. Now, they had even more than that, but he had 10 camels that he was carrying his wealth from Abraham back to Haran with him. And notice, his master's goods, it says there in the middle of verse number 10, he had his master's goods were in his hands. Keep that in mind as we look at the responsibility of a servant. And of course, that goes back to verse number 2, is he ruled over all his house, and Abraham was very wealthy as well. So he made the camels as he has arrived, verse number 11, camels to kneel down outside the city wall. It was the evening time, and it was a time when people would come out to draw water. Now, what people came out to draw water? Last part of verse number 11, it was the women came out to draw the waters. That was their job. All these things began looking at falling in place just right to fulfill and to be able to, this servant to get what he needed. And we're looking at that last point. If you think about that last point we looked at a moment ago. Verse number 12. Where does the servant begin? As he said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, please give me success this day. You know, you've been kind, you've been good to my master before. Please show kindness to him now. And can you help think that, what did Abraham promise that would go before him? An angel would. Sounds interesting, doesn't it, Paul? An angel. What was that angel's form? Now, we don't know about this angel anymore, how he did it or what happened, but the promise that there was going to be supernatural help as he would accomplish this task. So he says, I'm here at the well. The daughters of the men are coming out to draw water. And he says in verse 14, let that the young woman that I say this. He's going to be speaking to one of the ladies as she comes up. Please let down your pitcher that I may drink. And she says, drink, and I'll also give your camels a drink. Let her be the one you have appointed for your servant Isaac. And by this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. Now, this is a what? What is this servant doing at this moment? He's praying to God. And in his prayer saying, please help me. I need your help. And if this could be the way it plays out, let it be. And has an angel maybe given him advice as he's coming to this point? We don't know. It doesn't tell us that he has. But he's looking to God for his help. And as he comes to this point, he says, when these things play out, I'm going to ask her for a drink. And she gives me a drink. And then the key words be, she'll say, let me water your camels too. Now, imagine, be willing to give somebody a drink? Most everybody would. What's the likelihood that you would give somebody a drink and then offer to water 10 camels that have just come in from a long trip? Now, it's been a while back since I've actually looked at numbers of how much water a camel can drink. But a camel can drink lots of water. I'm thinking up like, up to close to 50 gallons of water they can drink. Now, that may be more than what it is, but they could put away lots of water. And they had been traveling, so she would be willing to draw lots of water for this camel. So he's asking for a lot. Now, let's be realistic. How often will someone come across that'll be that way? But what is the test for? The test is looking for the one who had the right kind of heart, wouldn't it? He's looking for a woman for his master's son's wife. He wants her to have the heart that would be a heart that would be a servant, one who is willing to give. Interesting thought. So, verse number 15. Before he was finished speaking, so here he was saying this prayer. It had been in his mind, it could have been outward. We don't know. It doesn't say specifically. Behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the son of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with a pitcher on her shoulder. So what do we have? We have a relative. Now, as we begin thinking of relatives at that time, kissing cousins was not an uncommon thing. Today, you start thinking you don't want to marry too close to your kinfolk, right? Because you're going to have problems. But at this time, the gene pool within the human race hadn't been mutated. It hadn't degraded to the point. Doris probably has the scientific descriptions of how all that works. So this would be a perfectly okay and proper thing for them to do, even though they were cousins, right? So here she was of the family. So he came, the young woman, verse number 16, here's one of those keys too. You got to please your master's son. She was what? She was a pretty lady. She was beautiful to behold. And she came out with that pitcher on her shoulder. And when she went down the well, she filled up the pitcher. We find verse number 17. The servant watching her said, she's the one. And he goes running to her, ran to meet her and said, please let me drink a little water from your pitcher. There's that first step. Now, he expected to get that, and he stops, and I'm sure he's drinking, he's enjoying the water. And she says, drink, my Lord. Then she quickly let her pitcher down from her hand, gave him a drink. And as he finished, he's wiping his mouth off, and she said, I'll draw water for your camels also, until they have finished drinking. Now, it'd be one thing, I'll draw water for your camels, pour a little bit out, okay, I'm done. But no, I'm watering your camels until they've drunk all that they're going to drink. So, looking there at that, her heart. Quickly emptied her pitcher in the trough, ran back, drew some more water for all the camels. And here the servant was. He just refers to him as the man. Again, we don't have his name. He was wondering. He didn't say anything. Is God going to make this work out? Is this really the one? It's playing out just as his prayer was. And he's looking at the providential direction of God. Abraham promised the angel that would lead him and help him there. So when the camels finished drinking, he took a golden ring nose. Now, how does a ring nose fit on a nose? I'm not sure. It wouldn't be a ring like this, would it? It'd be some kind of piercing or something that would have put on her nose. And it was made out of what? I just said it, didn't I? It's gold, wasn't it? And what value does gold have? It's worth about $1,000 an ounce or whatever it is. I don't know. Gold is worth what people will pay for it. And it is something that is very, very pretty and very lovely. If you, looking at gold, and we're going to find Laban, her brother, in a little bit. Ding, ding, dollar signs are going to show up in his eyes. It got his attention. I'm sure it got hers as well. But not only a gold nose ring that weighed half a shekel, but 2 bracelets. And he put them on her wrist. They were 10 shekels of gold. So they weren't just a light little weight trinkets, but they were weighty. They were of size. And he asked her the question, whose daughter are you? Please tell me. And is there room in your father's house for me to stay? Now, he already had an idea who she was. He had that connection as it came about. And she said to him, I'm the daughter of Bethuel, Milcah's son, born of Nahor. There's the family connection, just what we needed. And moreover, she said to him, and there's plenty of straw and plenty of food, and there's a place for you to stay right there at my house. And so here's this servant. He bows down, and you imagine what he did? He didn't worship her. He didn't say, oh, you're so wonderful, you're so great. He worshiped God. It says in verse number 26, he bowed down his head and worshiped the Lord and said, blessed be the Lord of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his mercy and his truth toward my master. As for me being on the way, the Lord has led me to the house of my master's brethren. And so the young woman, haven't got her name yet, we know who she is. She runs back to the house, tells her mother and everyone in her mother's household all these things. So the word is now going back. Verse number 29 as we're following along. And we're in Genesis chapter 24, verse number 29. Now Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. And Laban ran out to the man by the well. Hey, his sister's doing what as she comes in? She's jingling. There's the sound of gold on her wrist. There's a sparkle in her nose. And so he runs out to the well. Now, Laban, what do we know about Laban in the future? Who's going to come visit his uncle Laban? Jacob is, isn't he? Who will later be named Israel. And Laban, if you remember the event, he does all he can to take advantage of his nephew, Jacob. Of course, God blesses him and is able to go out. But Laban's heart is not quite like his sister Rebekah's heart in that he was, reading between the lines, you can see that he's focused upon the physical. So he comes out, he saw the nose ring, saw the bracelets, he heard these words, and he went to the man, he stood by the camels by the well. Their last part of verse number 30 says, and there he stood by the camels by the well. Now what's on the camels? What would be on the camels? There'd be lots of treasure. It's the truckload of stuff, right? And the phrase just says he stood by the camels by the well. What would you be doing as you stood by the camels by the well? You're looking at the stuff, aren't you? I wonder what's inside that bag. That may be. Oh, I can tell what this is. We're looking at his heart, a little peek in his heart. And he said, come in, oh blessed my Lord. Why do you stand outside? We prepared the house and a place for the camels. Come on, come on. And so the man came and he unloaded the camels, provided the straw and the feet for the camels, and water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. So Abraham's servant is being taken care of. Food set before him, the banquet set, and everybody's ready to eat. We have this great guest. We're about to feed him. And the servant, Abraham's servant, no, I'm not eating. I will not eat until I've told my errand. And so he said, speak on. So he said, I'm Abraham's servant. The Lord has blessed my master greatly. And they're going, yes, we can tell. And we could also look back in Genesis chapter 13 as Abraham was, the word says, was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. God had blessed Abraham richly. And we've made the point before, is it bad to have money? No, it's not bad to have money, but you can't let the money have you. And that's where the money has a problem with. And Abraham, we believe we could say, had a perspective. It's not his, it all belongs to God. We'll talk about that more in just a second. He says, I'm Abraham's servant, and he's been very blessed. He has all these animals, all these servants, all these camels and donkeys and all these things. And then verse 36, and Sarah, my master's wife, has borne my master when she was old, born a son to my master when he was old, and to him he has given all that he has. Now, of course, here we think back, Laban is thinking, all this, maybe we can get tapped into this, right? Perhaps he's thinking that. Now, my master made me swear, this is verse 37, that you'll not take or a wife from my daughters of the land of Canaan, where they were. You're to go to my father's house, my family, and there you're to find a wife for my son. That'd be verse number 38. So now, what we're going to see in verse number 39 and following, on down to about verse number 48, a retelling of the events that had taken place. So he said, this is what Abraham said. He said, don't you go back to that land. Don't take my son back to that land. You bring him back. If she doesn't come, you'll be released from it. He retells the whole story of how he prayed the prayer, let the woman who comes out and gives me drink and waters my camels. He tells all this story again on down through verse number 48. In last part of verse number 38, and he blessed the Lord my God, my master Abraham, who led me in the way of truth to take a daughter of my master's brother for his son. Now, I want you to bring that to our attention because what he has just said is that God is the one who led him in accomplishing all these things. And God's word is truth. God's direction and God's will is truth. We can trust in his way. So he says that into verse number 48. Verse number 49, he goes back to the topic at hand. So he's described to Laban. You know, he's the one that we've met so far. Laban and his family, all that's taken place, all that God's laid out before him. Verse 49, now if you'll deal kindly and truly with my master, tell me, and if not, that I may turn to the right or to the left. Let me know, do I continue this? I need to know because whether this is the case or not. Now, can you see here? He's saying everything's fallen in place just so perfectly. Can it possibly be it? Maybe it's not it. At this point, it could have been, they could have gone, oh, well, maybe you're right. And he got up and he could have went on. It wasn't the one. So he is putting his trust in God, but he's realizing that it has to come together on their part too. So how will it take place? So Laban and Bethuel, the son and the father, answered and said, things comes from God. We cannot speak to you either bad or good. This is from God. It's not from us. Here is Rebekah before you. Take her and go and let her be your master's son's wife, as the Lord has spoken. They recognize too, God has spoken this. Now, why was it that Abraham did not want a wife from people of the land of Canaan for his son? They were pagans. They were idol worshipers. They did not know and trust God. Going back here, did they have problems with idols back in their household there? Yeah, they did. But there was a sense of still recognizing that there was God. And that's why he said, we've got to go back and find someone who's at least still recognizing God. So they say, God's the one spoken, that's the way it'll be. So again, he hears these words. This is Abraham's servant. He worships God, bowing down to the earth. He's worshiping and recognizing. He brings out the gold, silver, and all these things, the clothing, gave them to Rebekah, precious things, also to his brother and to his mother. So they're enjoying all these riches too. And the men, and he and all the men, of course, there was a whole caravan who went. They ate and they drank and they stayed the night. Then they rose the next morning, and he says, send me away to my master. I'm ready to go. Now, hospitality, no. Stay a little bit longer, right? Stay longer, why be in such a hurry? Let her get, say her goodbyes and everything. And he tells them in verse number 56, don't hinder me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away so I may go to my master. We all recognize God has brought this together and it's all falling into place just as God would have it to be. Let me go. And they said, we'll ask the woman. We'll ask the young lady, Rebekah, she can say whether to do it. And she says, will you go with him? And she says, I will go. Now, again, you're looking at this young woman's heart. They sent Rebekah away, and her nurse, and Abraham's servant and his men, and they left. They blessed Rebekah and said, our sister, may she become the mother of tens of thousands, and your descendants possess the gates of those who hate them. A little bit of prophecy, right? Through Israel, then her son, this will take place. So Rebekah and her maids get up, they get on their camels. Now the camels have really precious cargo, right? It's carrying these ladies as they're going back. They departed. Isaac was there in the field, verse 63, meditating of the evening. Remember what's on Isaac's heart still? His mom has passed away. It's still heavy on his heart. And he lifted his eyes and he looked up there and the camels were coming. Rebekah lifted up her eyes and, now this is going to be bad. No, I'm going to tell it anyway. First instance of someone smoking a cigarette. Rebekah lit off her camel. It's terrible. I'm sorry. No, she got off her camel, and I tell you what, I think James Dew says, Dole, stay away from jokes. It doesn't work for you. It doesn't work for you. So he gets off. She got to the camel. They come. This is your master. Took herself, covered herself up, and the servant told Isaac all that had taken place, and just as a few words, but I'm sure he said a whole lot of words then. Isaac brought her to his mother's tent, and they become husband and wife. And it says the very last there, verse number 67, the last of the chapter, Isaac now finally had comfort after his mother's death. Isn't it a fantastic event? It'd been a while since I'd studied it, and so I think it's a servant. This is a really, really encouraging event of a servant. But now let's look as we consider what can we learn about this servant. And I've told you my 6 points already. Again, you being involved in the class and like to make a comment, would love for you to do that. We're going to look at these 6 things and make reflection of the event that takes place. So does anyone have any comments before we jump into that? Okay, we have one back here, and we have Bill. That's great. Paul?
Yeah, come a little closer. One thing I was thinking about when he was praying, when he dismounted and was sitting at the well, waiting for the women to come out.
Yeah.
This is another example of a servant of God laying a fleece before God.
Yeah.
Here's some conditions. Let me know what your will is. And, as we can do the same thing, because we don't have an angel or Jehovah saying, Paul, don't go there. It doesn't work that way. And so, we have to really know what God is wanting us to do. Or if we know what our mission is, well, what about this or that? There's a lot of variables. And so I think, one, it tells us to pray to God, lay before him our desires, whatever, and then he will answer them. And I think this is a great example of what of that.
And as we look at ourselves, God's not going to direct us in direct such as that. But as we have an understanding of God, who he is, his character, we know his word, his will, his direction for our life. And when we do come to those crossroads and we begin to evaluate what's going to be the direction that would be best for us, and sometimes we simply will not know. And sometimes it may come to a flip of the coin because there would be one way or the other. But as we do enter that, though, we trust in God. We put our trust, as Mary did, we talked about last week, as Mary said, here's your maidservant, do with me as you would please. And we turn it over to God. But very good, Paul. That's right. I think Bill had a comment.
To me, being by myself and everything, and the work I do, most of you all know,
Yeah.
I have to depend on God totally and the Lord Jesus. And a lot of decisions I have to make in my life, I've done my best to try to follow his example, try to follow him. And like you said, being a servant of the Lord, trying to be the best servant I know how to be, I try to depend totally on God to divide me when I go places, when I'm going to go out of state, wherever I'm at, for his safety, for his providence, for his helping me and guiding me in what I should say and what I should do and in my work that I do. And I think that's the thing that we all should do as Christians is totally depend on God, not ourselves, because as it says in Jeremiah 23, it's not up to man to direct his own steps.
Yeah.
We need to depend on God to direct our steps. And if we do this, I know he's blessed me a lot in my life, and I'm so thankful for that.
Yeah. And we come down to it, we don't know what will happen, but we know that he'll never leave us nor forsake us. Hebrews chapter 13, verse number 5. Any other comments? And as we go along, if you have something, go ahead and raise your hand. We can look at it. But the first point, do you have something, Doris?
It's a question. I don't want to put you on the spot, but of course we have the whole Bible, to look
Yeah.
at today. But could somebody misconstrue that him asking, the servant asking God to show him a sign? I mean, I hear my friends all the time say, I prayed and I just asked God to show me a sign. I was always afraid to ask for God to show me a sign because it might be a bolt of lightning. So what I think we should do is not depend on that in that way. But what do you tell people when they are discussing that with you?
Because what our concern is that looking at, is God providentially going to take me and say, this is where you're going? Because there's some who believe that there's no choice of ours whether we're going to be saved or not. God's either going to elect us or he's not going to elect us. And they'll put more into God than what the responsibility comes back to us. And that's a concern we have. As we go along, we say, well, if we look to test God, do we say, God, if you'll do this for me, it's kind of like the guy in the foxhole. The bombers are going, if you get me out of this, I'll never drink another drink again. I'll be a good guy if you just get me out of this. We're trying to make a deal with God. And that's not our point. That's not what we need to be about. But what we do is we come down to these things in life that we look, because there's decisions we have to make. As you've made decisions through your life, whatever, whether who you're going to marry, where you're going to move to, you're going to buy a house, you're going to buy a car, you're going to change what kind of cereal you're going to buy for breakfast, and maybe not so much that. But as you begin looking at all the different decisions we make, do we stop and think, God, what's going to be where do you want me to do? What is your will for me in this life? And trust that he's going to help you find that way, Because I remember very clearly, I was dating a young lady, and I really thought the world of her. And it was my first time to ever fast. And I was praying to God, and I was hungry as a bear. And praying to God, help me to find the right one. Did I believe that He did? I know that He did. And I married her. And as we look at those, and by the way, that pot of beans that was cooking there on the stove that all day long, I was waiting to eat to break my fast that evening. Oh boy, it was sure tempting. But a focus and saying, God, I'm trusting you. You've got to help me. And God will help us. Not in some supernatural way where He's going to pick us up and say, okay, here you are, and there. And not in the sense that, okay, if you do this, I'll do this, and this will be, not making a deal with God, but we're trusting God. So it can get kind of a thing that we can run away to the other side saying, well, we can't, ask God to help it, or, do this for me. And so we don't ask Him at all. And then we miss out on the comfort that we have as we put our trust and confidence in Him. Good question. Good thought. Katrina.
I think it's important that we give God the credit after the fact, though. Wherever we end up, wherever we're placed, He's going to bless that, and He's going to do His will through that, and for us to be grateful for where He did place us.
Exactly. Knowing and putting confidence. Let's go to number 6. So that's one we're kind of focusing on right now. A servant looks to God for His help, His providential care, and we'll go back to what Katrina said in just a second, and that's going to be I'll find that in a second. Number 6, jumping around. All these verses that I have listed up here, it's going to be times that the servant is finding that direction from God, as Abraham, let's see, 6. He's going to be praying for God's help, verses 12 through 6. Abraham's going to assure that God's going to help him, that angel's going to go before him, and knowing that God helped him with all this, God's care for him, God bring him to this point. Philemon chapter 1, just one chapter, verse 15, it's talking about Onesimus and him running away from his master, which this may be one of our servants we look at too. Onesimus is a pretty cool study too. Paul says, perhaps this runaway slave, this took place, departed for a while for this purpose, that you might receive him back forever. Because Onesimus became a Christian after he ran away from his master, which was highly against the law. Philemon, who was a Christian, owned Onesimus as a slave. Says perhaps all this took place. Perhaps it all took place because for it to play out. Now, come back to Doris's point. The key word here is perhaps. We don't know. We don't know. And as we go through this life, perhaps. But in the end, as Katrina pointed out, what we do is we thank God. We give God the glory and God the credit. In Revelation 14, verses 3 through 5, as we see God's followers as they give, as God's taking care of them and as they worship Him. And this would go along with Katrina's thought about worshiping. They sang, as it were, a new song before the throne. There are 4 living creatures and the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had redeemed from the earth. Who can know this song that's be sung there in eternity's realm? It's those who are God's children, those who obeyed Him. These are the ones who did not defile themselves with women, for they were virgins. Of course, now that's talking in not in a sexual sense, but in a sinful sense. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever He goes, putting their trust in Him, knowing God's going to care for them. These were the redeemed from among men, being the first fruits to God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no deceit, for they were without fault before the Lord, before the throne of God. So we have them looking to, knowing God's going to take care of them. Paul.
Another thing I find interesting is that, within the household of God, the trust in God is contagious.
Uh-huh.
So you have Abraham sending his servant. He tells him what he's going to tell him. Everyone accepts it. If it is God's will, then that's the way it's going to be. Well, then I find it interesting that as the story goes on, they want Rebekah to stay around for a couple more days.
Uh-huh.
But then the servant persists.
Yeah.
And then they give her the option which a lot of people have a very misconstrued about God and females and all this. I mean, they're really valuing her
Yeah.
and her opinion. And so going back to the idea of being a servant, like a servant of God, she says, I will go. And so putting her faith all into God. And so, it's really amazing how the story pans out, because you have a family, Abraham, who trusts in God. You have his brother who trusts in God. And now you have the continuation of the children trusting in God as well.
Yeah. And we'll see within all the story, all these events here, there's lots of warts. They trusted God, but did they have things that weren't, they could. But ultimately, the bottom line is God chose them. God said, you're going to be my people, and I'm going to accomplish my will through you. And our prayer to be as well, God, accomplish your will through me. As we look here, the other things I have, a servant is given responsibility over his master's belongings. And said it before, we all recognize that, and oftentimes need to be reminded of it, though. Absolutely, everything I have does not belong to me. It belongs to God. And when we start thinking and realizing everything we have belongs to somebody else, a whole different perspective. Known people who are given responsibility to give away large sums of money in a grant or something like that. And they said, this is the easiest thing to do. I can give this money away all day long. I can find places and give this money. I'm talking about thousands and thousands, even millions of dollars at a time. Because it's what? Well, it's not my money. Now, think about us and ourselves. Here's Abraham's servant. He had all his master's wealth at his fingertips. And Abraham would say, do this, do that. Hey, that's easy. Why? I know it doesn't belong to me. Now let's look at the point ourselves. All that we have in our grasp that we're doing is not ours. It belongs to God. And as we handle what God has given to us, we trust in Him, saying, God, what you want, I'm going to. And will we make mistakes with it? Yeah. Will we be cheated? Yeah. Ever come to a point where you ever help somebody and end up being a I won't say what I'm thinking, but it's really disappointing. But it's God's. It's God's, and you turn it over to God. The servant has that responsibility over his master's belongings. Recall there in Matthew chapter 25 is the three servants who are given the master's goods, and as it says, delivered to his servants. They're good, his goods. It's in his hands. Whose was it? It was the master's. Whose hands was it in? The servants. And we are those servants of master's goods. A servant, too, must be good for his word. Remember putting that hand under the thigh. What you're about to say, you're going to have to do it. Do not disappoint me. And as the servant went, he knew he had an out. Hey, if she said, no, I'm not going to come, he was released from it. No problem. But he was going to do all that his master wanted him to do and not back up on it. As Jesus tells us, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything beyond that is from the evil one. So being good for your word. Number 3, a servant is going to follow instructions. I find it, working at Chick-fil-A, how many people cannot follow instructions. You do this, and they go, no, do this. Now, I'm kind of slow, and the instruction is that as a delivery driver, we're to make sure everything in that bag is on the ticket that we're delivering. Okay, I'll look at something. What is a DISPUCK? I have no earthly idea. Oh well. No, what do? I'll go to find someone. What is this thing? It's supposed to be in this bag. Oh, well, that's just a discount. Don't worry about that one. Oh, okay. Well, how was I to know that? But he's going to find out what the instructions are. What does this mean? And then we're going to follow them. So here he was. Abraham gave very specific instructions to his servant. This is what you're to do. Not go back. Don't bring Isaac back. Bring the wife back, and you're released. So very specific instructions. Key. He who, not everyone says, Lord, Lord, into the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Just a couple more real quick. A servant is going to depend upon God. he's going to pray to God for help. And we're going to see there in Acts chapter 4 as the apostles in that early persecution, they prayed to God, God, please help us. You're the one who can help us and be with us. Knowing that God will not forsake us. He is my helper. He'll always be there. And then, they turned me off. They might have turned me off back there. Number 5 is, as a servant carries out his master's instructions, is he's going to recognize God's blessed him and he's going to give glory and worship to God. We look at Colossians, it's bondservants. We are bondservants. It's not ours, not us. It's all about him as we look to him. Any other comment? And you'll be on overtime. Anything else? So enjoy the class. Look forward to looking at another one of God's great servants this next week, Lord willing.